Thank you, Colin. I learned a few other things on the north side of Youngstown, where I grew up in a family of 9 brothers and sisters. I learned that sharing was required, and it benefited everyone, whether we liked it or not. I also learned in that blue-collar city where the workers were supported by strong unions, that the benefit of the collective was also beneficial to the individual and their families. If one of us were vulnerable, if one of us were weakened, it made all of us vulnerable. I learned that certain things were worth fighting for. And from my grandma, I learned how to make pies. With her magical hands, I learned how to mix the butter and flour in the alchemy of pie dough. So those are all rolled together with my recent experiences as a career public school art teacher and now as a teacher educator to make myself an accidental policy wonk. And in this role, as an accidental policy wonk, I argue for art education as a civil right. You may be wondering why art education as a civil right, and even where. Today, I argue for art education as a civil right in the encompassing expanse of our public schools. Art education, however, occurs many places. It does happen in our homes and in our communities, on our street corners, in our faith communities, in our tribal families and communities. It happens in more formal places like museums and after-school programs, and even boys and girls clubs. This form of art education is strong and valid, and I robustly support it, but today's focus is squarely within our public schools. The question of both where and why I argue for art education as a civil right, these questions are intertwined. Our public schools are still, despite some of their flaws, and despite not completely rising to this noble goal, still our greatest hope for equal opportunity in our democracy. Education is understood vastly as the synchronous acts of teaching and learning. And when I bring those ideas to education, I come to it from a Paulo Freirean perspective in the roots of Paulo Freire's work, who argued that to be educated and to educate is to become more fully human. That synchronous act of teaching and learning is about learning to read our world in order to change our world. And if education is about becoming more fully human, then certainly the arts are a requirement. How do these lofty ideas get translated into our public schools and into our democracy? Well, we have these social agreements in the United States. These are really rooted in our most endeared documents, like our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and certainly in our 14th Amendment from way back in 1866, our first Civil Rights Amendment. We have social agreements that the collective good is generated by the collective sharing. For example, we pay taxes, we have roads, we pave our roads so that cars can drive on them. This doesn't benefit only those who drive and own cars. And when we pay our taxes so that our snowplows plow them, it doesn't benefit only those who own and drive cars. This is good for people who ride buses, ride bicycles, push strollers, walk. It's more safe, and our transportation is more efficient because we all contributed, we all benefit. We have the same ideas in our public schools. We fund our public schools through taxes. We have a piece of federal taxes, a chunk of state taxes, and a giant pool of our local property taxes that fund our public schools. This works really well in many regions for many people. If your property is worth a lot, then your schools gain more income. And the formulas that we've tried even in the past 5 decades, to try to equalize that, have not met their potential. So here we have a tension between our promise for equal opportunity to education, housing, and employment in a democratic society and the ways in which we pool our collective resources. It's part of our social agreement that we're all going to pitch in. There's also an assumption that we all believe that those little human beings that are running around and eventually become preschoolers and elementary students and middle school and high school students, that they are worth our investment, because we know that very soon they're going to be running our society, and we want them to be smart about it. So why? Why art education as a civil right? Why? Because if we do believe that education is to become more fully human, then certainly the arts, which show us our humanity, which express our humanity, which expand our view of our humanity, has to be intertwined and a necessity and vital to it. Why a civil right? Because our public education is founded in the very fiber of our democratic ideals. Why right now arguing for art education as a civil right? This is the reason why. You may have heard these conversations. It's a shame. The arts are always the first to go. I've heard it dozens, hundreds of times probably, because as those tax configurations and the way that our communities can support our schools become more and more strained, and as the budgets gets tighter, our local school officials are challenged and stuck in a conundrum of what to do and what to fund. And we'll hear these conversations from the same administrators and the families and even the students that it's a shame that the arts are the first to go. It's often stated in quiet resignation and a sad concession. This concession exasperates me because it impedes action. We might be more honest if we said it's an egregious breach of our dedication to our democratic ideals, that the misguided decisions of the very few are prohibiting our entire future generations of becoming more fully human. Or more simply stated, when a 7th grader sees that art has been taken out of their schedule, this sucks. But conversations that include the word "this sucks" or even egregious breach of democratic ideals are unpleasant. And so we turn away from those conversations to move on to more solvable problems in our daily lives. These are only unpleasant and only unsolvable if we maintain these questions and conundrums through a view of scarcity. Scarcity impedes generosity. Scarcity cultivates fear and propagates desperation. It narrows our vision about possibility. What if we rethink the question about art education as a civil right and how to support that in our schools from a perspective of abundance? This is not just about money, it's a question about what is it that is worth our investment to maintain a democratic society, to fulfill the promise of our future for all students to become more fully human. Who is it and what is it that is worth our investment? Do we acquiesce to the harsh criterion that the accident of the zip code that you were born into determines that opportunity for your full humanity? Is that the United States democracy that you believe in? What happens when we turn this question into a view of abundance? We have abundance in the United States. Where is it? We have an abundance of creativity, technological innovation, expansive enterprise, artistic achievement, scientific discovery. We have an enormous amount of abundance. This is far more valuable than money. However, lucky for American corporations, when you are an American corporation here in the United States embracing our ideals of free enterprise, it's not just about money, but you can turn all of those qualities into money. For example, Forbes tells us that these 4 companies are on the top of the world, in the $40 billion range, top of the world. Apple, the most valuable of them all. Right behind them, ExxonMobil, JP Morgan Chase, GE. I submit that we all participate in this. I certainly do. My iPhone's in my purse. My Mac is on my desk. Everybody in my family has a Mac. I, unfortunately, buy more fossil fuel than I'd like to and consume it. And today, we're all participating in GE's abundance. The lights are on. If we all participate in it, my question is, oh, and these guys, they're still the 2 richest guys in the world. And I'm happy for them. My question is, how do we share it? And in the absence of my grandma and my mom, we have to set out some ideas about how do we share it. And I don't mean just grants, not just grants. Grants are important. I want them to propagate and continue. They serve a really important purpose, but by nature, grants are created as a selective amount of money for a selective few. That is different than the ideals of being a full participant in a democratic society. We also acknowledge that everybody I just mentioned pays taxes. They pay some federal and state and local taxes. But what if we consider the abundance in the United States economy? What if we consider it as a requirement when you get to be an American corporation and cultivate abundance based on my participation, your participation, all of our participation? What if it's a requirement that you contribute to the future of cultural cultivation? I think that's a good word for taxes. It makes a lot of sense because the benefit of the many also benefit the individual. The benefit of the individual benefits the many. We all contribute. So how's that work, you say? All right, let's take an example. Last year, the film industry, $10.8 billion at the box office. $10.8 billion. I'm happy for them. I know that some of them lost a few million when they made multi-million-dollar films, and I feel bad about that. But I'm happy that they made $10.8 billion. How'd they do that? They did it through the work of artists, animators, graphic designers, actors, writers, production designers, lighting artists, audio artists, editors. All the realms of human thought, all the skill of robust intellectual rigor, all the expression of humanity that we are diminishing in our schools. How's that work? Let's take another example. The NFL, 32 teams, worth a collective of $1.7 billion. This in a country where we are eradicating physical education from the schools. I think they could share. I think we need to rethink the school budget pie. We've been looking at it through the lens of scarcity. And I'm not talking about the corporations coming in and running our schools. Some of them are already doing that. I'm talking about you accessing the abundance that you're participating in through your locally elected officials, through your locally hired teachers and administrators. Some may call this un-American. If we call it un-American, I would like to say it's not just about money, it's about our democratic ideals. It's about the future of our society. It's about responsibility to our civil rights. We have to look at the pie recipe. We have to consider the policy and practice that gets mixed into it. And when we think about that, there's 3 policy ingredients that we need to consider. We've got our human resources. The greatest schools have the greatest teachers. It's a very simple equation. We need to pay them, and we need to pay them more. We need to make sure they still have access to collective bargaining. We need to make sure they have access to health care that works, that isn't breaking the backs of the local community that's paying for their health care and the teachers who are paying their premiums. You may have heard a little bit about this recently in the news. This is something we need to fix. We have another civil right, disability rights, that we want to make sure we are able to continue supporting robustly in a way that makes sense. Because fortunately, Our students in our schools today, we are able, through our research and our current practices, to provide greater access to become more fully human. Because of our fluence in diagnosing and our practice, we are able to provide more expansive educational opportunities for all students from all walks of life and all needs. It requires an enormous amount of resources. This should not stress out a principal to decide if they can support one student or two, and whether or not every child has access to art education. Then we have something that's not a civil right. We have a multi-million-dollar high-stake testing industrial complex that has been gobbling up an enormous portion of our pie. It has become a runaway train since 2001, when No Child Left Behind was enacted, and it has just expanded. The egregious breach here is that these are private corporations that are taking your tax dollars that we collectively agreed to supporting our public schools and making multi-million-dollar profits. We have to rein it in. The other problem with this is that infects and actually poisons the ingredients of practice in our schools. We used to ask questions about teaching and learning practices from big philosophical and academic questions like what counts as knowledge. But now we have the testing industrial complex driving the answers to those questions. We already know that we've corralled disciplines into distinct silos, and that art and music and theater and poetry and phys ed and sometimes computer science all get tossed into everything else that doesn't quite count as knowledge. So I submit this. If to be in an American democracy, if to be a full participant in a democratic society means that we have equality in education, employment, and housing, like our most precious documents tell us, if education is to become more fully human, which requires that the arts are part of it, then this is not just about money. It's about democratic ideals. We've got some requirements to fix this. You know what a requirement is. If you don't do it, you don't pass. Nobody gets a pass on this. We have to make sure we fix health care and pay our teachers well. We need to make sure we keep funding so that every student from every walk of life, every race, every class, every special need has access to equal education. And we need to take some radical action. We need to harness the runaway train and put the brakes on the high-stakes testing industrial complex and reclaim the resources that are going there. Standardized tests should be used occasionally for diagnostics to inform teaching and learning, not to punish children and teachers and principals and schools and entire communities to close the schools. We need to reclaim those resources and our question about what counts as knowledge. We need to radically rethink and re-excavate our tax code and think about distributing abundance. I don't claim that this is easy as pie. My grandma taught me that if you're going to make one pie, you might as well make a whole bunch. Because then you have some to give to the neighbors, a few to put in the freezer for another day. You have a lot of choices of flavors, but most important, you can make sure everybody gets some. What could be more American?